Welcome to a new podcast series, and I have a very cool guest for you today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Emilia Lounela. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki, and I'm doing my PhD on incel communities.
Do you want to tell what was in incel phenomena that was interesting for you or sparked your attention and interest?
Yeah, I don't think there's like one specific thing that I can remember that made the decision for me, but I feel like it's such a topical phenomenon, but it also pulls together so many different both historical and topical phenomena that I feel like I can kind of look at several things at once when I'm looking at incel communities. There's so many political and social and cultural things wrapped up in there.
Oh, I can see what you mean. And you did some kind of study on this also, on the incel community. Do you want to tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I've written different articles, scientific articles on them. I'm doing discourse analysis. I'm looking at the online discussions from different incel forums, and then I'm also doing interviews with either current or former incels. I've interviewed mostly Finnish ones, but some from abroad as well. So I'm trying to understand what kind of worldview and ideas are being shared in those online communities, but also what participation in those communities means to the people who take part in them and who identify as incels.
Do you have maybe some kind of idea about if this phenomenon is different? Like, is it bigger in some countries? Is it connected to culture in any way?
That's a really good and really difficult question. Firstly, because this is an online phenomenon, and the people who discuss on these several different forums that also kind of evolve over time and change, and people take part in different online communities in different languages as well. It's really difficult to tell, for example, how many people are there because they are using pseudonyms, and they might be completely anonymous. So it's really impossible to say how many people, for example, take part in these. And of course, it's also really difficult to draw boundaries between, for example, what is an incel space and what isn't. And when I've interviewed people who, at least at some point, have identified as incels, that identity has also changed over time. So at some point they might be really strongly identifying as incels, and then at some other point in their lives they're not sure about it, or they might be going back and forth. So it's so fluid that it's really difficult to kind of draw direct, strict boundaries between those like different identities, and also it's difficult to say because many who identify as incels might not participate in those discussions. They might be reading them, and for long periods of time, they might not be reading them and still identify as incels. So it's almost impossible to kind of give any kind of numbers in this case.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I can imagine it's multicultural space where people can contact in English from like all kind of countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been looking at mostly English language discussions, and those are at least the most well known and probably the biggest ones as well, because people from different backgrounds and different languages can usually participate online in English, even if it's not their first language. But then there are like some other language spaces as well that I don't know as well. I know that there is at least like Russian, Italian, Turkish, but I don't really research these myself, so I don't know them that well.
Yeah. How do you think this process happens of constructing this incel identity?
That's the main question. That's what I want to find out as well. It's really complex. There's, of course, as in the world incel, it comes from the words involuntary celibacy. So they feel like they are in involuntary celibacy. These people are mostly heterosexual, and they feel like don't get the romantic or sexual attention from women that they would like to get, and that they often feel like it's because of their looks that they're not attractive enough, but there's also personality and social issues involved as well, and these differ from person to person quite a lot actually. But this is at the core of the incel identity, that they are involuntarily celibate, or at least they feel like they are, and this is somehow beyond their own control. But then there's so many different things attached to that as well, like the expectation of what kind of attention and how much attention or sex or relationships with women normal, so-called normal men should have, and how they feel like they're not meeting that expectation and that ideal, and that's why they feel like they are somehow less than other men. So there's so many cultural expectations of what a proper man should be like, and they feel like they don't fit that ideal, that it goes much beyond just not having sex. It's about feeling less than and feeling not good enough. And then, of course, there's a lot of misogyny as well. There's a strong victimhood identity. They feel like they are being oppressed and that the world is against them and women hate them, and so on and so forth. So then it kind of turns into a strong misogynistic mindset as well, that women are seen as both the thing that they really want and they feel like is lacking in their life, but also something that is causing their suffering.
Mm. Well, I don't have much knowledge about this, but as far as I learned during my studies as well about the incel community, I got the idea that people who are maybe depressed about not getting the relationships they want and the social world not meeting their expectations, they have a lot of pain about that, a lot of disappointment. But I don't think they have maybe much places where they can kind of go with this pain, especially now with the cancel culture and all that stuff. So I think it's kind of logical that they might end up in this kind of community, even though maybe from beginning it is not a person with incel identity necessary. But then I also noticed, and I think you also talked about this in your lecture, that some people who are in these communities, they might kind of get advantage from those other people who kind of just got lost there because maybe they were searching for support or just a place where they can talk about these things without being judged or cancelled. And some people who might actually maybe try to spark something aggressive in others who are involved in the community. I don't think this is the majority. Statistically, it's hard to imagine it would be a majority, but I think these people might have a very big impact on somebody who is very vulnerable and who goes for support, for somebody who will listen to you. And I think they might be victims themselves in one way or another in these kind of communities. Do you think there is some way to kind of define what kind of conversations can be like potentially harmful or maybe aggressive towards other people or society and might end up in something bad or something criminal, and what kind of conversations are more in support of feeling like socially strained?
You had many good points in there. I think it's absolutely true that people who end up in these communities usually don't have an incel identity to begin with, but they're looking for explanations for their situation and maybe support or other people who are also experiencing the same things that they are. Many of the people that I interviewed have, for example, experienced bullying and some kind of marginalization in school, for example, and that also sparks the feeling of not being good enough and being somehow faulty, and there's something wrong in me, so how can I fix this thing? And then they might end up in incel communities and kind of looking for that information, and the information they find there is that there is definitely something wrong with you, but you can't fix it in any way, so you're destined to be this victim for your whole life and there's nothing you can do. Women will never love you, you will never have a relationship, you will never experience sex. And that is, of course, really hopeless and really depressing. And of course, many people are already struggling in their lives when they end up in these communities, and then they get this really, really hopeless worldview from there, which explains everything, but explains it in a very depressing way. And as you said, there's a lot of very violent and hostile rhetoric in these online spaces. I would say most of the discussions are in some way violent or hostile or dehumanizing against women. So that's an issue in itself. It definitely normalizes this kind of violent worldview and this aggression and sort of revenge towards women and the society at large. Then telling apart what is going to end up in violence, for example, as some people have ended up doing violence, at least partly inspired by the incel worldview. That's also a difficult issue because the motivation is really, really, really difficult to tell apart. And there's so many things affecting that at the same time. But I would say it's almost impossible to say what discussions or which participants would be actually violent and which would be just kind of following the discussion norms of the community. Because in these communities, because the victimhood and aggression is such a strong part of being an incel and kind of signaling that you belong in these online communities, it's such a big part of the discussion culture that you're also supposed to be writing like that. So people who wouldn't necessarily talk that way in other areas of their lives or to other people might be doing it in these incel communities because it's just what you do there. And then some others might actually be kind of getting inspired from that and maybe actually planning something violent. And it's I would say it's almost impossible to tell apart.
Yeah, it's so interesting also, I think, what you mentioned in beginning, that these people kind of support the idea that, yeah, you are the problem, this is not fixable. But at the same time, there is a lot of also the world is the problem and the women are the problem. And so it really seems really hopeless. Like you're the problem and the world is the problem. So there is no really solutions. So it was just a lot of people discussing how everything is really troublesome. It sounds really desperate.
It really is. It really is. And like reading the discussions and especially talking to people who either identify now or previously have identified as incels, it is really sad. These people have a lot of pain. Of course, you can't generalize. There's a lot of different people there, and not everyone is like suffering, or not everyone has been bullied or stuff like that. It's not like the extreme misogyny present there is like a mental health issue. It's definitely an ideological issue, and they shouldn't be mixed up. But definitely, there's a lot of suffering, and I feel like in many ways these people are some sort of victims because they are also like buying into the patriarchal idea of what it means to be a proper man and a respectable man, and they feel like they can't reach that ideal. So then they kind of are looking for people to blame, and misogyny is very prominent in society in general. It's not just an incel issue, but a much broader systemic issue. So the narratives are already there, and of course the incel misogyny and their narratives are much more extreme and much more violent, and this kind of like violent rhetoric is much more normalized in these communities. But the core ideas about what women are like and what men are like are much broader and much more systemic and have a much longer history in our society and culture. So they're definitely not just coming up with these ideas by themselves. They're maybe modifying them, but the core ideas already exist and are quite systemic and shared in our society. So it's kind of easy to accept these ideas and maybe make them more extreme in that community.
Mm. Do you think the gender role expectations, they have like a big part in this?
Absolutely. I feel like, and I think a couple of the people that I interviewed for an article even said that they feel like the lack of sex isn't the main thing in their inceldom. It's feeling inadequate as a man and feeling not good enough as a man, and also lacking all kinds of intimate connections with friends, with family, with other people in general, and not just women. But I feel like maybe in our culture also for heterosexual men, the expectation is that the partner is the most important intimate connection, and that's the person you can share everything with, and maybe the friendships for many aren't that deep, or at least for the people that I interviewed, they might have some friends and some work colleagues and stuff like that they would talk with daily and have connections with, but those connections wouldn't be deep enough for them to share their true feelings about their life situations, for example. So they felt very alone in general, not just with the lack of sex and relationship with women, but just like with people in general.
When did this start, this phenomenon? When and why we got the name for it?
That's a really interesting story, actually, because in the beginning, this goes back to the early history of the internet. Actually, these incel communities were started by a woman, and they were meant as a support group and kind of peer support for people who are experiencing loneliness and are not having the relationships with others. It was definitely not just for men, and it was not just for heterosexual people, but it was for everyone. And it's really difficult to say what happened, but at some point it kind of started going this way and becoming more and more hostile and bitter. And there were these kind of misogynistic revenge ideas against women, and it kind of just started going in that direction and was really difficult to bring back. So I think then the other people who would have been spending time in these communities in the beginning didn't really want to do that anymore because it was becoming more and more hostile. So basically, what happened is what often happens on the internet, that it became kind of an echo chamber for very hostile thinking and very kind of polarized thinking.
So interesting. I didn't know it was started by a woman.
Yeah, right.
So basically, it's like a peer support for people who experience loneliness from the beginning, and then it just evolved into something.
Exactly. And actually, I interviewed someone who used to take part in these early communities and was really disappointed in the direction that they had taken, and had tried to kind of make a difference somehow to kind of convince people that this is not the way to like fix this situation and this is not okay, but felt like that it was really impossible already, that it had gone too far.
I kind of think it's of course really sad this is happening, but I think it's kind of logical for this time, because I think I see it in a way that women maybe had longer history of fighting for their rights and longer history of conversation. Why gender stereotypes, roles, patriarchy? How is it bad for you, basically, in the long run? And how does it hurt you, and how it takes your rights away in many ways, maybe subtle ways, but still. But I think there was no such conversations in history or on such a large scale for men. So I think to me, it seems like many men can be logically still stuck in kind of old ways, without as much places to kind of evolve to be in our time, to deal with things we're dealing today, not like 200 years ago, and have tools for that. So I think it kind of makes sense, even though it's of course very very sad to hear that it took such a big turn, and it's happening on such a large scale now. And it doesn't sound like it's really healing environment for them, or like opposite.
Yeah,
and for society too.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And many of the people that I interviewed described how bad spending time in these spaces was for their own mental health. And for most, that was the kind of reason they realized that they have to take distance from these spaces, that it was so depressing and hostile and hopeless that they just couldn't keep spending time in them if they wanted to improve their own well-being and mental health. So that's definitely a big part of it. But somehow they still manage to draw people in and kind of keep them in as well, which is very bad for everyone. And as you said, there's not many spaces, at least for the people that I interviewed, that they felt like they could go to and discuss these same issues. and find people who are experiencing the same feelings and the same kind of loneliness and isolation that they are. So I absolutely think that if there were more positive spaces where people could and men could discuss these things, and if there was more public discussion about these issues in general, that they wouldn't feel like they are the only ones experiencing this, or incel communities wouldn't be the only place they can find where people are talking about these things. That would already improve the situation quite a lot. But I feel like, as you said, there's been more talk about how patriarchy hurts women, and maybe I'm starting to see it now, but still less talk about how it's hurting men. But it definitely is, and this is a good example of how that happens. It's still, and I think we can see it in how, for example, incel is also used as a word to like just throw around to bring people down, or use to kind of ridicule people who might not even be incels but might not look like or act like we expect proper men to act like. So it's used as an insult because it's somehow shameful to be inexperienced sexually. Of course, it's used to kind of say that you're a misogynist as well, but it's also used as an insult because not having sexual experience is somehow shameful and embarrassing in our culture. And I feel like many men are not willing to discuss this publicly, and incels are one of the only ones that actually do say out loud that we don't have experience, we feel like we're failed and we're ugly, and no one likes us. And that's not something people really want to identify with, unless they feel forced to, as incels do. But if we had people who would discuss these issues publicly without identifying as incels and without promoting misogyny, then that would give possible examples of how to deal with this without the hostility.
Why do you think they feel forced identifying kind of loud publicly about this or like that?
That's a good question as well, and really difficult. I think it differs quite a lot between individuals. But for many, it feels like they finally found a place where people understand what they're going through. So then it feels like a relief in some way that finally someone sees me and someone sees what I'm going through. And also, it's an explanation that is kind of telling you that things are outside of your control. And some people that I interviewed said that at first, at least, it was a relief to realize that it's not, it's nothing I can do. Like, I've tried everything and it hasn't worked, so I can just stop trying. And in some way, in this culture and society, it can be a relief to stop trying and just say it's outside of my control. And of course, the hopelessness and hostility and violent rhetoric makes it very harmful. But still, at first, at least, when they first found the communities and identified as incels, it was a relief for them.
Did you notice when you interviewed those people who were identifying as incels before but are not anymore? Is there something similar between their journeys towards this new identity, which is maybe more beneficial for them and healthy?
Yeah, I would say at least one common thing between them would be that they realized that this was bad for their own mental health. It wasn't, for most at least, it wasn't that they realized that this is wrong, or like morally it's not okay to be blaming women for my experiences or something like that. That came later, but at first they just needed to take distance from these communities and from reading the material every day. And it wasn't easy for many of them, because like some of them even describe those communities as addictive. Something in that kind of suffering is somehow addictive, and of course the peer support, or at least like peers, is something that everyone somehow needs, and that's where they had found it. So it was difficult for them to step away from these communities, but they did it because they realized that they couldn't keep on living like this, that it was kind of pulling them deeper and deeper into anxiety or depression or just feeling bad. So the first step for many was to take some distance, and then they started thinking, all these kind of worldviews and explanations that I've gotten from these communities, does it really match reality that I'm seeing outside of these online spaces? For example, one person described how, I don't know, going to a grocery store, they would see all kinds of people walking hand in hand and being in relationships. So it wasn't just the most handsome male model chads and alpha men that would find girlfriends, but all kinds of people, normal people, normal looking people with normal personalities, and the variety of people who had found love with each other was something that they kind of realized didn't match the narrative that they had found online in incel communities. So these kinds of like small steps away from these communities and from this worldview, but a lot of it is very individual as well and depends on the situation of the person kind of rethinking their identity. Some of them had other people very much, other things in their life in quite a good shape. They had other people, they had friends, they had family. For others, they felt like it was a mess and they were really struggling with other things as well. So depending on this, I think the pathways out of these communities differ quite a lot.
It sounds like it's crucial to get away from this space that kind of feeds you the same picture all the time, to see the bigger picture, or to start seeing those couples that look different and diverse and they're still together, and maybe see that there can be more to that than just how you look, or this maybe stereotypical pictures we have about masculine and feminine. And
absolutely, yeah, but that can be difficult if there's nothing to fall back on, like there's nothing to replace that community. So that's why I said that if we had some other communities where these things could be discussed, that would be really, really helpful for these people who are somehow already thinking of, or are somehow in some way ready to take that distance and kind of rethink their identity. I think for many people who are maybe in the like deep end of this incel identity or these ideas, it might be more difficult, but because it's an identity that kind of evolves through time and changes and fluctuates depending on your own life situation and all kinds of things, then there's like points in time where this distance would be more possible than in other, and if we had something for them to fall back on those times, then that would definitely make it easier.
Do we have some alternative spaces that maybe already exist for people who are maybe in the beginning of the journey and they might be in the risk of getting into incel communities that will not be beneficial for them or anybody around, or for people who are trying to get out from this and find some healthier spaces for them to go through their own struggles?
That's a really good question. I think there are some initiatives. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know several different NGOs and organizations in different countries have some programs, but I think it's not that well known. People are kind of waking up to this phenomenon, or have been in the recent years. So this is something quite new. I do know that, for example, in Finland, there's an NGO called Miesakit that is doing all kinds of men or men-specific work with men who have, for example, experienced violence or committed violence against spouses, or needs different kinds of peer support in difficult life situations. So they have a project on this where people who either identify as incels or have these feelings of marginalization and anger and bitterness towards society and maybe towards women can come and discuss these issues freely. I think it's really important that these NGOs and these actors actually understand this phenomenon, because there's a lot of suspicion against outsiders in incel communities, and there's a lot of wrong ideas about incels in public discussion as well. So if there's an understanding of what this phenomenon is about, then that definitely helps in designing these interventions.
Can you give you like concrete examples? What kind of misunderstandings or stigmas people insight incel community have towards the world and women, and how this society functions maybe, or how the relationship function, and also vice versa, what kind of misunderstandings maybe we have towards incel communities or incels.
Yeah. Well, in incel communities, I have to say that, of course, not every person who identifies as an incel thinks like this. It changes, but these are the kind of the common narratives that we see in these discussions, and that are kind of shared in these online spaces. The idea is that this is all somehow biological and evolutional, that women are this way and men are this way, and that cannot be changed. So women are, for example, not seen as very individual, having individual preferences in looking for a partner, for example. It's usually thought that women are looking for superior genes, and therefore they're looking for men who look like male models and are super tall and super athletic and super muscular, and anything other than that is not preferred. And personality, for example, doesn't really matter that much as long as the men look good, which, for example, I would say is not true. But that's the expectation of what women, for example, are looking for. And overall, there's this idea that the ideal masculine type that we see in, for example, movies and cultural products is something that women actually want. It shows in these communities as well that oftentimes I feel like men are much more focused on this like ideal masculine type than women actually are, or the kind of the ideal for men is very different in men and women. Of course, overall, this is a very kind of heterosexual way of looking at things. It's very kind of like there are two genders and this is how they act and this is what they want. So that, of course, is a misunderstanding in itself, or a simplifying of how the world works. And then there's the ultimate victimhood, that they feel like their situation is that they're oppressed and they're hated, and everyone hates them just looking at them because they're so ugly and stuff like that. So it's very kind of catastrophic thinking as well. And when we look at public discussion, I feel like it's very black and white. It's either, oh, these potential terrorists, what can we do about them? And of course, not every incel is a potential terrorist. Many people are just looking for that peer support. And even if they have misogynist ideas, it doesn't mean that they would act violently or do mass violence or something like that. Or the other end is that, oh, these are just like poor, misunderstood men who are just looking for girlfriends. So if they just got girlfriends, then this issue would be solved and there wouldn't be a problem, which of course isn't true, because even though for some people it might make their lives more pleasing, then for example, the issue of misogyny wouldn't just erase itself. So it's a much more complicated issue than what we usually see in public discussion, especially in the media. People are looking for very simple answers to very complex questions. So they want to say like, oh, this is what it's all about, and this one thing will fix it. And that's usually not the case in any kind of like social phenomena, but definitely not in this either.
I think because I'm studying sexual counseling and education, just kind of reminds me how important it is to have a good sexual education from like school, elementary school, because I think it exactly gives you the tools to understand how masculinity and femininity were constructed as part of societal expectations, what part of you being a woman or a man, for example, is biological and what is not. And I think it gives really freedom to maybe discover your own ways of being masculine or feminine, or more ways discovering your own identity and how it feels comfortable for you. And now how that's something you just have to embrace and then struggle with that because it's not really beneficial or doesn't fit anymore. I think that's just reminds us how important that is.
Absolutely. And just discussing these issues and also the difficulties that people might have with them is super important and something that's still lacking. For example, the people that I interviewed, some of them described how they felt these things were really difficult, but then other people made them look really easy or didn't really share their difficulties because you're kind of expected to show this strong outside and be a masculine man and not have any issues with women and sexuality and stuff like that. So they felt like they were the only ones struggling with these issues, and also that in any movies or TV series or any kind of like pop cultural things, they couldn't find other people struggling with these issues, or if they were, the issue was fixed in the end, and that was the happy end. That they didn't get. So they were like, what's wrong with me, and what's the problem? And then they found incel communities. So if there had been more open discussion about this in schools, in friends groups, in pop culture, then maybe they wouldn't feel like this is something that defines me as a person.
Yeah. Was there something in these studies or interviews you made that really surprised you, or something you did not expect but found out?
Maybe the difficulty of leaving the worldview and the communities behind. Of course, I wouldn't expect it to be super easy and just like a snap out of it kind of thing. But how difficult it actually was for many people was surprising for me, and also made me realize how much they would need help in dealing with this and coming out the other way. I think that was something I didn't expect, because they were discussing how it might, like for some people it might be a years long process. It might take years, and even like, and for some people even after 10 years they might still in difficult situations and emotional situations be falling back on those old narratives, and they would have to fight against that and kind of go against that and say like, I'm not that person anymore. So it's definitely stuck in their head for a really long time, and that was surprising for me.
I think from this I can kind of draw a connection to addiction field, because I'm working now. I'm like a social worker in mental health and addictions area, and I think this sounds very similar, like just the process of getting away from all this that was harming yourself and others for a long time, because that has been too long the only place where you still got something out. Yeah, that's not easy.
It's definitely not easy, and I think that's super interesting that several people described it as addictive in the way that you know it's bad for you, but you still keep going back because maybe there's nothing else, or maybe you feel like this is the only place where people actually see who I really am, and stuff like that. So it's I don't research addiction, and there's of course differences as well, but there's definitely similarities already in how this is discussed.
Do you think some specific topics are very important for the further examination of this phenomenon?
I think definitely more research is needed on how people experience the participation, how they end up in these communities in the first place, how they participate, how different people participate, and how that changes over time, and then also how they end up leaving. I think what I found in my interviews was really interesting, but it's only a very kind of small sample of people. So more research like that is definitely needed, because then we can also design help and interventions for the people who are perhaps wanting out of those communities but don't know how to do it, or don't know how to take the first step.
Yeah. Are you planning to do more projects or studies on this theme?
Hopefully. I found it really interesting, and I feel like, for example, the interviews that I've done, there's so many different themes that I couldn't include in one article. So I would love to continue on that further as well.
Okay. Well, I thank you really much.
Thank you
for finding time and discussing this. I think this is something many people are talking about now and are interested in. But I think, just like you said, we have a lot of misconceptions about what is it. it's either this or that, either poor people or really bad violent people, and everything that's between that's actually important for a change gets kind of overlooked.
Absolutely.
So I think this was a very important discussion.
Thank you.
And I learned a lot. Thank you.
Good to hear.